But Tottenham, it's the history of the Tottenham.
Tottenham Hotspur, a team that's been memed to hell and back in the past decade or so. Lads, it's Tottenham. I'm sure we're all familiar with the phrase. On one hand, we have a team that's gotten ever so close to silverware on a more or less regular basis, but just seems to fall short when push comes to shove. Dread it, run from it, bottle drop jokes on Reddit still arrive. But on the other hand, we have a team that has fought their way from being a lower to mid-table squad to a consistent top 6 club and even title contender in a relatively short amount of time without foreign investment. A team that made it to the Champions League final only a few short years ago and seems to find themselves with genuine world-class talent as a norm nowadays. Even further to that, because football only started after 1992, of course, it's easy to forget that whatever the sport was called before then had a history in itself. I thought today would be a good day to take a brief trip down memory lane to explore Tottenham Hotspur's successful past, the bumps in the road they've had to weather along the road, and find out how they got to where they are today. So, with that being said, what is the history of the Tottenham? Yo, what's going on everyone? I hope you're all doing well. Strap in because we've got a long one today. Because this is a Spurs video, you already know Harry Kane will feature heavily, especially considering his recent almost move away from Spurs. I won't be covering this per se, so if you're interested in how him staying at Spurs following the recent drama may affect his career, head on over to Atlantis Football for the full breakdown. As explained in the intro, Tottenham Hotspur is one of the most enigmatic clubs in English and even European football for that matter. A team that's been described as simultaneously the best and worst team in the Premier League. Their history is rich, deep, and definitely requires some semi-in-depth analysis at the very least. So what better place is there to start than the very beginning? Formed all the way back in 1882 as the Hotspur Football Club, the club was initially created as a means for the members of the Hotspur Cricket Club to still play sports during the winter. The club was renamed in 1884 to Tottenham Hotspur to avoid confusion with another already established football club in the area, a name which the Lilywhites, as we all know, hold to this day. Fast forward to Good Friday of 1898, and Spurs were playing a match against soon-to-be rivals Arsenal, or rather Woolwich Arsenal at the time. After fans climbed on top of a refreshment stand in a ground they were renting, causing it to collapse, Spurs decided to find a new home, and so they moved to the site that would soon be known as White Hart Lane. Only 3 years later, in 1901, and Spurs, who weren't even in the top flight and had only gained professional status as recently as 1895, won the FA Cup. In doing so, they became the first non-league club to win the trophy, an achievement that's never been repeated. Not too long after this, the Arsenal and Spurs rivalry was in full swing. First of all, Arsenal relocated from South London, where they started out, to North London in 1913, just 6.5 kilometers from White Hart Lane. This was a no-no. Spurs felt as though this was their territory and were naturally pretty offended. Adding on to that, Spurs were relegated from the First Division in 1915. What made this a point of note is that following this season, the top division expanded from 20 teams to 22. Spurs were relegated and Arsenal were promoted despite the fact that the Gunners finished in 5th place in the Second Division. Now, this was due to them being voted in rather than them earning promotion, which explains it somewhat. But certain Spurs fans still believe to this day that the vote was rigged. Yeah, the North London derby is quite a deep-seated one. On that note, I know this is probably temporary, but if the Spurs boys of yesteryear could see how their boys are doing now, I bet they'd be proud. Arsenal, on the other hand,
I prefer not to speak, really. I prefer not to speak.
Over the next few decades, Spurs saw some success as they reclaimed the FA Cup in 1921, but equally they also experienced a few more relegations, most notably in the 1927-28 season where they were relegated despite finishing 21st out of 22 teams, only 6 points below 4th place Derby County. I mean, back then each win only counted for 2 points, so it was more like 9 points in today's terms, but still. That is tough. Anyway, after a brief return to the top division in 1933, they dropped right back down in 35, and following that, as war broke out across Europe, football was understandably put on the back burner. By 1946, football resumed, and after spending 8 full seasons in Division 2, Spurs made a dramatic return to Division 1 in 1950. I say dramatic because they won Division 2, promoting them back up to the top division, then won Division 1 in their first season back. An insane feat. So insane that, from what I could find, a promoted team has only won the top flight 5 times in the history of English football. Liverpool in 1906, Everton in 1932, Ipswich Town in 1962, Nottingham Forest in 1978, and of course, Tottenham Hotspur. From Tottenham's perspective, the reason for this was simple. This guy, Arthur Rowe. More specifically, a revolutionary concept he is credited with creating known as push and run, a playstyle whereby a player offloads the ball to their mate, runs past his marker, and receives the ball back once in an unmarked position. Today, this is more commonly known as a give and go, or more simply, a 1-2. So at this point, you're probably thinking, dude, what do you want about? That is not revolutionary. Well, at the time, it kinda was. Although variations of this playstyle were around back then, it was Rowe who focused in and formalized it, using it as a highly effective weapon. Spurs didn't retain the title the next year or continue to challenge in the years after that, but fast forward about a decade and the Spurs' golden generation had arrived. Rowe had stepped down due to the pressures that came with the job affecting his health, and after his replacement Jimmy Anderson failed to impress, he promptly resigned and in came Bill Nicholson. A man who was not only part of the Spurs team that won the league in 1951, but also remains to this day the most successful manager in the history of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. 3 years into his tenure, and he had won the First Division and the FA Cup in the same season, the first double won by an English team in the 1900s. Coming off the back of such a successful season, they signed a man that remains the most prolific goalscorer in English football history, Jimmy Greaves. Oddly enough, he signed from AC Milan for a fee of £99,999 to relieve him of the pressure of being the first player to be signed for £100k. And I think it's safe to say that he did not feel the pressure. I say this because he scored a mind-boggling 357 goals in the English top flight throughout his career, with 220 of them being scored for Tottenham. To put this into perspective, Alan Shearer scored 283 goals in the top division in his career. That includes his playing years before the Premier League was created. Having said all of that, quite astonishingly, Jimmy Greaves never actually won the league in England throughout his career, which is one of the most ridiculous facts I've ever heard. I swear these guys are cursed. Imagine having the greatest goal scorer in English football history for 9 years and not winning the league. That is tough. But let's not be too harsh. He did win a very decent haul of major trophies with Spurs though. These included 2 FA Cups and a European Cup Winners' Cup. In a previous video, I noted that Manchester United was the first English team to win a major European trophy. Apologies for that, this is incorrect. United were the first English team to win the European Cup. However, the first English team to win a major European trophy was Tottenham Hotspur, having won the Cup Winners' Cup in 1963. With Nicholson still at the helm, Spurs went on to win a couple more League Cups as well as the UEFA Cup in 1972. These truly were the golden years in the history of the Tottenham. And it didn't even end there. Even though they suffered a slump when Nicholson stepped down in 1974, despite being relegated and promoted once more, they still managed back-to-back FA Cup trophies in 81 and 82, as well as another UEFA Cup in 84. Sounds good, right? Well, you shouldn't be surprised to hear that this period was not without its drama. Spurs didn't win another trophy throughout the 80s, but were more or less a mid-table side and were doing decently for the most part. However, in the boardroom, things were a bit frantic. In the early 80s, Spurs fell into some serious debt due to refurbishments required by the stadium and bolstering the team. Seeing a moment of opportunity, lifelong Spurs fan and property developer Irving Scholar led a takeover of the club in 1982. In an attempt to maximize the profits of the club, the team became the first football club from the United Kingdom to be placed on the London Stock Exchange. Further business diversification attempts from the club included sportswear, a women's fashion line, a travel agency, and even boxing promotion. Now, this may sound outlandish, because it is. However, it's important to note that at the time, few English teams were applying commercial principles to the running of their club, running it as a business, so to speak. This, as well as the endeavors of a few other clubs conducting similar initiatives, served as a bit of a case study, one that ultimately paved the way to the widespread commercialization of the English game today. In any case, after a rough period that saw Spurs fall into even more debt, reportedly £20 million by 1991, the team was in a bit of a pinch. Regardless, in the middle of all of this going on, a Spurs side managed by Terry Venables and led by Paul Gascoigne and Gary Lineker won the FA Cup, a victory made all the more sweeter thanks to this incredible Gascoigne free kick against Arsenal in the semi-finals. As the years went by, after being taken over once more by former Spurs player and manager Terry Venables, this guy that won the FA Cup, remember him from a few seconds ago, and businessman Alan Sugar, Spurs began to see better days, from a financial perspective at least. Initially, Sugar invested heavily in the club, helping pay off their debt. Although, despite the fact that Sugar and Venables went into Spurs as equal partners, Sugar slowly gained more and more of a stake in the club before eventually having full control by late 1991. He then used that power to dismiss Venables in 93. It's pretty cutthroat stuff. This whole episode was quite wild and convoluted, and I've left out so much of what's been reported to have been happening at Spurs in this time period to paint a simplified picture. Okay, we're gonna take a bit of a perception break here. We've been through quite a bit of information in this video thus far. Backed by popular demand, here's a picture of a puppy. Just the goodest of boys, isn't he? Okay, break over, back to Spurs. Alan Sugar, who was once heralded as the club saviour, was now disdained by the fans due to his sacking of club legend Terry Venables. Pair that with minimum investment in the squad and the perception that he cared very little for the club, and it's not hard to see where Spurs fans were coming from. You see, Sugar saw the club as a business, nothing more, nothing less. He famously got confused when people asked him if he knew how old the club was. He was reportedly unaware of Tottenham's incredible double in '61 and apparently didn't even know who Bill Nicholson was. You are messing with people's religion and people are not going to accept that easily. The words of Terry Venables in response to the way Sugar was operating. He wasn't wrong. Sugar himself admitted the purchase of the club was a mistake on his part, from a business perspective at least.
The biggest mistake of my life, giving 10 years to that football club. And I should have actually not done that, stuck with my electronics business, and maybe I would have been Facebook instead of Zuckerberg or Google instead of someone else.
By 2001, after years of abuse, Sugar had finally had enough and sold his share to English National Investment Company. The company is, to this day, headed up by Joe Lewis with majority ownership and Daniel Levy. I'm sure you all know him. Levy was appointed as the chairman of the club upon the takeover and remained in this position ever since, making him the longest-serving chairman in the Premier League at the moment. Levy, a no-nonsense businessman who rules with an iron fist, also heads up the transfer negotiations for the club. When referring to negotiations for Dimitar Berbatov's transfer to United, Sir Alex Ferguson once stated that dealing with Levy was more painful than his hip replacement. Regardless, I think many would agree that Levy has played a large part in getting Spurs to where they are today. He's not perfect, but I'm sure he's preferred over the likes of Irving Scholar or Alan Sugar. But perhaps I'm out of line here. Spurs fans in the comments, let me know how you feel about Levy. Moving along, while Chairman Roulette had ended, Manager Roulette was still in full swing. This club essentially had a revolving door much like their city rivals Chelsea. Between 1984 and 2008, 18 managers came and left, many being dismissed just to return a few years later as the caretaker. So taking all of that into consideration, it should not be surprising that following the 91 FA Cup win, Spurs found themselves languishing between the mid and lower table in the Premier League just about indefinitely. They did win the 2008 League Cup, but they also finished in 11th in the league that year. I don't think many Spurs fans remember that season as a successful one. Halfway through 2008, with the addition of Harry Redknapp, a bit more stability followed suit. This tenure helped plant the seeds for Tottenham Hotspur's recent rise in stature. Under Redknapp, they improved significantly, in large part thanks to key players such as Kyle Walker, Gareth Bale, Luka Modric, Jermaine Defoe, Danny Rose, and many more. They secured a Champions League spot for the first time in the Premier League era in 2010, and to top it all off, they beat Arsenal in the league for the first time in over 10 years. A 2-1 win which saw left-back Danny Rose, of all people, scoring this. He was 19 at the time. Crazy stuff. Despite this upturn in form, Spurs began to stagnate somewhat. They had reached the top end of the table but just weren't able to push through to the next level, consistently hovering over the Champions League spots. Even the insane blossoming of Gareth Bale wasn't enough to propel them forward, and the fact that Madrid took him off their hands for £86 million didn't help Spurs all that much. To be fair, neither did the 7 players they brought in with the Bale money. I mean, Christian Eriksen was a baller, to be fair to him. Anyway, I guess none of that matters, as Spurs seemingly found the pieces of the puzzle that would ultimately push them to the next level. In 2014, Daniel Levy appointed Maurizio Pochettino as the Spurs head coach, an Argentine manager who had done some very good work at Southampton. Poch brought in a fresh, energetic playstyle to White Hart Lane, a high-pressure, explosive setup that saw his players hound the opposition. This improvement was in large part due to some great recruitment, the promotion of academy players, and some existing players that stepped all the way up. The likes of Dele Alli and Eric Dyer were signed on, and Harry Kane, although he had been in and about the squad up to that point, was now a nailed-on starter. The emergence of Kane as both a leader and a goal-scoring machine came as a surprise to very many people. One of those people was Harry Kane himself. At the end of the 2014-15 season, his first full season with Spurs, he once said, "I achieved so many things. Stuff I wanted to do in a career, I did in one season, and that was a lot to take in." That season, he scored 21 goals in the Prem with 4 assists in 34 appearances and was only 2 months shy of his 22nd birthday by the end of it. Ever since that season, at the time of making this video, he has yet to score less than 24 goals across all competitions in a single season. But I personally don't see what all the fuss is about. I mean, the man is only a 7-season wonder. Moving along, Spurs' progression under Poch was therefore all to see. Within no time, they didn't just progress, they were challenging for the title. They went from 6th place in the year before his arrival, to 5th place in his first season with the club, to 2nd place in his 3rd season, their highest finish since winning the league back in 1961. The future was looking bright. Immediately after this season, Spurs bid farewell to White Hart Lane to accommodate the completion of their new state-of-the-art Tottenham Hotspur stadium. They then moved into Wembley Stadium until construction was complete. Not a bad place to shack up, to be fair. Now, Spurs did drop off the next season, although it was nothing too dramatic. A 3rd place finish with 77 points. And then the next season... Oh yes, sorry. They were given a transfer ban. Oh, they weren't given a ban. Oh, right, it was self-imposed. In the summer of 2018, Spurs became the first Premier League team in history to not make any new signings. None at all. Levy claims that this was due to certain assumptions that some players might be leaving and certain targets would be available. To be fair, that sounds reasonable enough. But listen, memes need to be made and we should never let reality get in the way of that. Words to live by. Over the season, the lack of reinforcements proved to be a major thorn in their side. Injuries to Harry Kane, Son, Dele Alli, and others didn't help the Lilywhites all that much. Although, despite this, Spurs didn't do too badly. A 4th place finish with Lucas Moura and Fernando Llorente stepping in to fill the goal-scoring gaps was a huge help. As a matter of fact, Spurs made it all the way to the Champions League final, in rather dramatic fashion, might I add. They barely made it out the group stages and came from behind against both Ajax and Manchester City in the knockout stages. But, to the relief of every Arsenal fan, Spurs lost out to Liverpool in the final. So, after a season where many expected Spurs to crash and burn, they didn't actually do too badly. Couple that with some promising signings and maybe Poch and his men were ready to go again. Oh no. He was sacked 12 games into the season after a poor start. Let's pause right there. Usually on this channel, when speaking about teams, I like to briefly go over the tactics deployed by a team during a landmark season in the club or team's history. A season where the club performed valiantly and ultimately walked away with silverware. But, Spurs haven't won anything significant since the FA Cup in '91. And in my opinion, at their peak, Spurs in the 2010s have probably been better than any Spurs side since they last won the league in the 60s. That's just my opinion. Although I fully acknowledge that I didn't watch every Spurs match over the last 60 years to verify that opinion. But whatever. So instead, we're gonna look at the tactics deployed by Spurs in the 2016-17 season, where they finished 2nd with 86 points. A season where I personally believe over the past decade or so, they played their best football. This is more or less how these guys set up. The team played in a narrow 4-2-3-1 more often than not, opting to play dynamic, creative players in the wide positions and in the center. This meant that they forewent out-and-out wingers. The team also lined up with a 3-man defense fairly often. A 3-4-2-1 or a 3-4-1-2 wasn't an unfamiliar setup for them this season. The reason behind this was to keep the attack narrow but allow for width to be provided by the wingbacks. We'll get to that in a bit. As Pochettino's side grew larger and larger in stature and ball-playing capabilities over the seasons, something typical of bigger teams began to happen. Teams began to allow them to have more possession, adopting more defensive approaches to matches with them. This was evidenced by the 60% possession stat that they averaged throughout the season, the ultimate show of respect. This was also due to the organized team press that Spurs implemented into their gameplay. Possession wasn't asked for, it was demanded. Up top, you already know Harry Kane was the focal point. With 29 goals in 30 appearances, his attacking presence was immense this year. Sat behind him were Heung-min Son, Dele Alli, and Christian Eriksen, the three aforementioned dynamic creative players. You can go ahead and disregard their placement in this graphic, as they would often shuffle and play in different positions across this line on any given match. Eriksen was typically given license to roam around the final third, finding space, receiving the ball, and threading the ball through to his teammates. Son offered the options of cutting inside to play down the middle or going wide with his blistering pace, while Ali would usually play quite centrally, making late runs into the box and playing that second striker role at times. In the wide areas, the fullbacks in Kyle Walker and Danny Rose were arguably the most important features of this side. With the attack playing narrow, these two had the task of shuttling up and down each flank to bolster the attack and to fulfill their defensive duties, a task which they accomplished quite commendably. But the only reason they were given the license to do so was the central midfield pair, two of Moussa Dembele, Eric Dyer or Victor Wanyama. Dyer and Wanyama were the anchors that screened the defense and would drop between the centre-backs when the fullbacks pushed forward to provide cover. Moussa Dembele was the box-to-box midfielder that was extremely press-resistant as well as a colossal ball carrier, one of the most important players in the Spurs sides of this period, not just in this season. A man who I don't personally think gets enough credit for the role he played while he was at Spurs. In central defense, the Belgian pair of Toby Alderweireld and Jan Vertonghen were a rather formidable force, both players who lacked considerable pace and athleticism but made up for it with positioning, defensive timing, composure on the ball, and communication. And at the back, Spurs had their current captain as well as the captain of the French national team, Hugo Lloris, a solid shot stopper and World Cup winner. All round, the real deal. This season, Spurs scored the most goals in the league, 86, conceded the least goals in the league, 26, had the Golden Boot winner Harry Kane with 29, the runner-up for the most assists in the league, Christian Eriksen with 15, the runner-up for the Golden Glove, Hugo Lloris with 15 again, and the least number of losses throughout the campaign with only 4. They still fell short of the league by 7 points. That is tough. After Poch was sacked, Levy brought in the special one, Jose Mourinho, to replace him. Uh-oh, said the footballing world. The fiery personality of Mourinho and the no-nonsense mentality of Daniel Levy essentially signified an all-or-nothing approach. Do you see what I did there? Anyway, Mourinho paired with Spurs' underperforming squad and Levy's reluctance to spend big was surely not the best fit, right? Correct. 1.5 seasons into his tenure, he was out. Which brings us to the current season. Earlier this year, the Swiss Ramble put out a brilliant Twitter thread showing the debt levels of major European clubs. Spurs ranked at the very top of the list with roughly £1.17 billion of debt. About £830 million of that is thanks to the new stadium. And thanks to the global illness, we can only assume they weren't able to recoup the money in ticket sales and functions that they would have hoped to. Now, this report was as of the end of the 2019-20 season, so we'll have to wait for someone to compile the updated numbers to see where they stand. It's not gonna be me though, I'm not gonna lie, that's too much work. In other news, Harry Kane signed a 6-year contract with Spurs back in 2018 in an incredible gesture of loyalty, and only 3 years later, decided that he felt he would look better in sky blue. Apparently, Kane and Levy had a gentleman's agreement, whatever that means, that meant that if Spurs failed to win silverware in the 2020-21 season, Kane would be allowed to move on. And seeing as how Spurs had their worst campaign since 2009, his desire to leave is rather understandable. We can argue all day about his decision-making in signing his 6-year deal, but let's rather not. All I'll say is that he clearly craves silverware.
I just want to win. I want to win trophies. I want to win the Premier League. I want to win the Champions League, I want to win the FA Cup.
So unless Spurs experiences a radical U-turn, I strongly suspect the Kane saga will reconvene in the next window. Nuno Espirito Santo has proven he has what it takes to go toe-to-toe with the big boys in the Premier League. In 2016, Wolves finished in 15th place in the Championship. Nuno stepped in the next season, Wolves won the Championship and were deservedly promoted. They then finished in 7th in their first season back in the Prem and have since become a top-flight mainstay. Whether he has what it takes to make Spurs title contenders once more is still to be seen. Over the years, Spurs have become part of the so-called top 6 in the league, but still pale in comparison to their adversaries when it comes to silverware and overall achievements. Since last winning a trophy in 2008, they have lost 3 League Cup finals, a Champions League final, come second in the league once, and 3rd in the league twice. Many call them bottle jobs as a result of this. I mean, it's hard to argue with that, they really should be doing better. But if anything, and say it with me now, football is a fickle sport. One day you're on top, the next, not so much. I personally believe that Spurs are a quote-unquote big club. If they can build some momentum and improve upon the performances that they've mustered in the past, who knows what the future holds. And there we have it, a brief dive into the history of the Tottenham up to this very date. Do you think Spurs are a big club? Do you think they have what it takes to win the silverware they desire so badly? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you made it this far, I appreciate you more than you know. Oh, you dropped this. Here you go. Anyway, that's all from me today. Stay safe, stay well, cheers, and I'll catch you on the next one.